What's going on YouTube? My name's Autobot Prelude, and my goal is to cover everything hardcore ladder for Diablo 2 Resurrected. And in today's video, we're talking about a tier list guide for early ladder pushing. Now, I'd like to clarify that this is for the first few weeks of the ladder, because things can change once you get past the first few weeks. This is specifically low budget builds that are going to help you farm very quickly. So, without further ado, let's dive in.
Stay a while and listen.
All right, let's talk about these low budget builds for early hardcore ladder magic farming and why I place them where I place them. So let's just lump C and D tier together. The general consensus with this group of classes or builds is that they're very high gear dependent, especially early ladder. Keep in mind, we're talking the first few weeks of the ladder. No one has anything, and if people get it, they're extremely lucky. And especially with the potential of shorter ladders, you know, loot's going to be more valuable, so people may want to hold on to things a little bit more, right? So we need to scrap the whole idea of, well, if I find that, right? No, we're not thinking that way. In this video, we're thinking, well, if I find nothing, what can I get? How can I efficiently farm, right? And this is how we're going to go with this whole video, that perspective, okay? So with C and D tier, they're very high gear dependent classes compared to the other classes, okay? All right, now when we're talking B tier, we have all our fire classes here that were S tier for early normal pushing, but they get knocked back a few tiers for mostly the fire immunities. It sucks in hell extremely bad, and don't get me wrong, these classes are really good for still farming Nightmare, but once you get into hell, it becomes extremely limited. Most of these classes could probably easily do hell and Duriel without an issue, so that is an option. And there are other areas that you could farm, but again, we're talking hardcore though, so there's things that you can accomplish in the game, but they might not be safe. We're talking safe and efficient, right? Because in ladder, right, your goal is to level up and hit 99. It's a race. Every time you die, that's a setback for you. And it's a big setback sometimes. So with that being said, we have B tier for fire classes. As far as the Smiter and the Zealer, same thing. They rely a little less on gear than these classes do, especially with your Zealot having the auras that put out very good damage, the Smiter stun locking bosses, and it having pretty sufficient damage on its own. But again, you start to need a little bit of gear with these classes more specifically, and then the immunity issue with these guys, right? Now we're talking A tier, okay? We have Orb and Summoner. Now you're probably wondering, well, why A tier, right? And that's because of, well, for the Summoner more specifically, he's more of a slow and steady kind of class, right? He's going to do well, but he's going to do things a little slower than these classes are going to do them, okay? For Orb, this was a tough pick for me. I would almost like to say it is S tier, but when we're talking early hardcore ladder, right, the very first week or two, when you have little to no gear, everyone's scrambling for spirit swords and insights, right? When you compare Blizzard and Orb, Blizzard just outdoes Orb. It just does, okay? Orb is extremely good for normal and Nightmare, all right? But once you get into hell, the damage starts to lack off a little bit, and that's when gear starts to become just a tad bit more important, right? Now, is the gear dependency as much as, you know, B, C, and D tier? Heck no, it's not. You don't need much gear for an Orb Sorceress, but you do need, in my opinion, a little bit of gear to keep up with some of these classes, right? Now, we're talking S class here. These classes have one thing in common. Well, two things, really. They're very efficient with low gear dependency, okay? Now, you could argue that, you know, these classes here in A tier don't need much gear either, and that's true. That is true. But when you compare clear speed, like with the Summoner compared to any of these S tier classes, the clear speed's going to be much slower. Now, Orb is arguably pretty close to these classes And I almost would like to say that orb gets like an A+ tier, right? It is good, it's very efficient, but the damage starts to fall off just a tad bit in hell difficulty, right? And that's why I find the Blizzard Sorceress, the Hurricane Druid, the Lightning Trap Assassin, the Lightning Javazon, the Lightning Sorceress, and the Hammerden to be the best classes for early hardcore ladder magic finding. Well, that pretty much completes the whole tier list and why I've placed everything where I've placed them for early hardcore ladder magic finding. Of course, once you get a few weeks into the ladder, things do start to change up a bit. Once people start obtaining gear, you know, you might find something that might not be good for you, but you might be able to trade it for something in return that will be very valuable for you, right? Especially with the shorter ladders, I'm very curious to see what's going to happen with the overall market with the items. Are people going to rely more on D2 JSP? Is if botting isn't prevented, is that going to become a bigger problem? Or, right, the perfect scenario here, in-game trading becomes a thing again. Man, will that be awesome. But needless to say, that's all I have for today. Y'all have a wonderful day or afternoon, at night, wherever you may be. And I'll catch y'all next time.